All right, so we're going to talk about the Intel gap in CMMC, the cybersecurity maturity certification, and how that's getting rolled out to the DIB, and how these passive insights gathered from open source intelligence can be used to elevate the RPO and CMMC engagements. So, if you're a consultant helping government contractors getting ready for the CMMC rollout, if you're a consulting firm, if you're an RPO, or even if you're a prime or a C3PAO who does the assessments or responsible for your subcontractors or teaming partners, this webinar is for you. My name is Francisco Velasquez, and I am the founder and CEO of HostBreach, a Intel-driven advisory firm. And my experience, it ranges from private sector to military to defense contracting. I've supported cybersecurity operations in top notch software companies, defense contracting, and other private sector organizations. So, my experience is really hands on with a lot of hands on expertise in SIM engineering, EDR, security operations. And for the last 5 years or so, I've been working inside of something called a cyber fusion center, supporting government contractors. So now let's get into the webinar here. Let's start off with a research from Merrill Research that indicated that only 4% of the contractors who they surveyed, which was about 300 or so, are actually ready for CMMC level 2. So, which was really interesting to see because it highlighted the difference between what the contractors believed, which they believed they were ready for CMMC level 2, versus the reality. When they conducted the survey, it turns out that only about 4% of them were ready, but yet initially all of the contractors, about 75% of them actually thought they were good to go. Now, on the more tactical side of the house, SpyCloud, a huge company, right, in this world of cyber intel, uh, they did another research, and it turns out that for the defense industrial base, that the companies who support right our government, DoD, they have 4.5 million corporate credentials that are in the dark web right now, tied to the 95 largest companies in the DIB. Okay, so these are credentials that could be used by an attacker to log right into an application, say, that houses CUI. So I hope that already you can see how this is critical because we've heard this before, right? Identity is the new attack surface, right? And attackers, they're not just brute forcing through firewalls anymore. They're logging right in with the credentials that they can purchase. Now, SpyCloud again, they found out that again for the 95 largest companies in the DIB, that there is a 65% password reuse rate. So these are the passwords that continue to get reused. And we'll look at how that impacts in the real world scenario, how that reuse rate can make a negative impact. Now, on top of this, as you see on the right hand side, I have a visual here. It's coming from the Hudson Rock Cyber Intelligence team. And it shows us here that there's an information stealer malware kit that can be purchased for as little as $10. Right now, this information malware kit, it does exactly what it sounds like. It steals information. It steals information of all sorts. So that could be session cookies, it could be documents, or it could be also all your passwords. So what happens is that an employee clicks on a malicious link or an attachment, or they just go out and they try to download something like a game, and they did not know, right, that this information stealer, this spyware, and essentially is also getting downloaded, and it's running in the background without the user ever knowing, and it's stealing all this information from their endpoint, right, from their workstation. And what happens is that This data that gets stolen, it gets sent back to the malicious groups who then sell this data on the dark web, right? So, uh, according to Hudson Rock, we have 30,000 infected devices. Uh, Again, this is in our industry, in the defense sector. So, as you can see also in this image, perhaps it's a little bit small, but you can also see that this particular malware kit is uh, supporting or being advertised as being able to capture .mil uh, uh, information here. So something that's really relevant to what we're doing here with CMMC and establishing a cyber posture in the DIB, right? Because at the end, what we want to do is be able to protect that CUI so that another country, right, doesn't develop the same sort of innovation even at a faster rate than we're developing here in the US, right? So now CMMC, by the way, is something that is really good. I want to ensure that this is not taken the wrong way. So I am all for CMMC. And however, we need to apply real world threat context to what we're doing, right? So in cybersecurity, we have a huge context problem, right? Why do we spend so much money, but yet we continue to have the same sort of incidents or at the same rate, right? And so, again, putting this documentation in place, putting these controls in place, getting the assessment is great. It's a good first step. Establishing a security baseline, and you should absolutely be using cybersecurity and compliance as a means for you to win contracts. Absolutely, 100%. However, this goes again beyond just that. It goes, and the point is to also secure the CUI again, like I said earlier. So just having this baseline is not enough, right? You need to apply context to it. So this is where the real world threat context and the intel comes into play to help you to enhance your overall strategy. Because as we can see here in this slide, we had a Russian APT campaign, Advanced Persistent Threat Campaign, from 2020 to 2022. And CISA, the agency who kind of oversees all of cybersecurity for the federal government, they said actually put out an advisory, um, essentially an article, a case study around this whole APT campaign. And what we've learned is that these Russian attackers, right, they were able to, first of all, get into the organizations unnoticed, and they were able to maintain what's called persistent access for over 6 months. That means that for 6 months, they were inside of the networks without ever being noticed and were able to come and go as they pleased. They were able to steal things like weapons, development documents, communications infrastructure plans, and more business data. And the root cause, it wasn't a 0-day sort of attack. This was weak multi-factor authentication, poor logging, right? What good is the alerts if nobody's looking at them? Or too much noise in the network, right? Credential reuse. This is what we saw in the metrics slide, right? In the previous slide before this, the credential reuse is a big problem. So these organizations in these 2 years that were impacted, the pattern here was that all of them had the required SSP documentations, the diagrams. They had, various levels of cybersecurity protocols. Some may have had more than just 110 controls that NIST 800 171 calls for. Some of them may have had more stringent controls in place, yet they still suffered catastrophic breaches. Okay, so here's the CISA advisory uh, at the top that you can also research on your own. And I highly recommend that you do so because here we have another CISA red team scenario. They had the CISA agency actually conducted a red team or hacker emulation exercise against a federal agency. And this is a separate CISA advisory that you can also go and look up and research and kind of study that for your own benefit and your organization's benefit. However, I'll speak on it very briefly here. Essentially, what happened is the CISA red team, they ran this adversary emulation exercise, and they were able to, using open source intelligence and using intel, which is the first sort of thing that any attacker really does, right? They use what's publicly out there about your organization just to see, right? Do they have any leak credentials in the dark web that I can just use to bypass a lot of controls? Does this organization have a vulnerability on any one of their public facing assets? Things like that, right? And they did just this. They were able to scan for public facing assets. They found a critical vulnerability that allowed them to run code remotely, and they were able to take over very fast. Now, this critical vulnerability that existed on this web server, it was observed for 3 months. And even after CISA notified the agency, hey, you have a critical vulnerability on this public facing asset, it still took them 2 weeks to patch that, right? So it's very important, this whole thing of patch management and vulnerability management, right? Because it's now 2025. It's not just about patching, right? There's some things also that require configuration change in order to address a vulnerability. Um, However, so I'm gonna actually show a visual of how this whole thing went down. But now, just real quick, what would have passive intel be able to give us in this sort of scenario? If this agency was using passive intel or they had an intel layer, they would have been able to identify that CVE, just like the CISA red team did, right? They would have been able to see some SSH uh, services running on these ports and so much more. But this whole exercise, what it really kind of the takeaway from this is that we need a defense in depth, and we need to use diversified layers of protection, right? Including having an intel layer, all right? Because here we see how um, in this federal agency, they actually had two separate networks. One of them was a Unix Solaris enclave, which in CMMC, by the way, you can get your whole company assessed for the CMMC assessment, right? You can roll out these security controls across the board. For some companies, that's applicable, and they do well off with that. Some other companies, they build what's called an enclave, which an enclave is an isolated network uh, that is used to handle things like CUI, and it's a dedicated network. And for some companies, this is a good approach, right? So the first thing that the red team did in this adversary emulation exercise is that they went after this enclave because it just had something that was already available to them, right? It was easy. So they conducted this OSINT here in the open internet. They found this external facing service, this web server with this vulnerability. They got into it by exploiting it. And to make matters worse, they were able to obtain credentials that were locally mounted on a file share. So then from there, they were able to establish SSH connections and hide that traffic on legitimate ports. And they were able to come and go as they pleased. Right. So it's really fascinating the way that they conducted this whole thing. Right. So now uh, they had also a separate network, which was a Windows network, right? And here's the timeline of how this whole thing went down. But this federal agency also had a Windows network, right? So right around here, you'll see that they start to compromise the Windows domain, right? So how do they do that? Is first they looked up employees on LinkedIn, public sites, and things like that. They found the names and email addresses. They identified who these individuals interact with in the public, and they started a spear phishing campaign. So while they were, doing other sorts of open source intelligence gathering and breaching the open uh, asset with that critical vulnerability, simultaneously they were also conducting this other sort of research, this OSINT, and conducting this spear phishing campaign in parallel. And so they were able to breach the Solaris enclave, and then at the same time they were able to get an employee to click on the malicious link, which then installed um, a, a rat on their workstation, right? So, and nobody detected this, by the way, on the federal agency. Okay, so many boo boos here. So Once they got foothold in the Windows environment, right, they were able to escalate privileges. And this on the Unix side also, they found backup files that anybody could read, which contained password hashes, which were later able they were able to later crack because they were weak passwords, and these were passwords that had been reused. I think one of those passwords was actually more than 8 years old. In the Windows side, they did the same thing. They found network share, everybody could access it. They found an IT share with a password file, and this is the file that was 8 years old. And it had never been changed or rotated, right? So these accounts had domain admin rights. They had complete control over the entire network. They were able to move laterally, created scheduled tasks. They used again that SSH to create tunnels to hide the traffic over legitimate ports. I mean, it was a total domain takeover, but it doesn't stop there. Unfortunately, they were able to discover trust relationships with partners. So the organizations connected to other agencies and found weak service accounts in partner one, partner two, and so on. And they were able to also compromise partner organizations. So this is really a scary part. And so here's the timeline, right? So they started back in 23. As you can see, several months happened here, maybe 7, 8 months, and this whole operation went unnoticed. Of course, now once the breach notification was sent out, there is a whole collaboration phase where they did work with this agency, and uh, they had lessons learned and things like that to put these fixes in place. And this is kind of the idea, right? When we do these sort of intel gathering and we do this OSINT work, and we don't just show you, here's what's publicly available to you. We also show you, and here's how an attack would go down, right? So that you can go back and fix or implement that into your overall compliance strategy. Now, just because, right, now we've seen some real world breaches or red team emulations, but just because you haven't had a breach, don't think that you're good to go, because we've seen now the DOJ hit corporations with false claims acts, right? So Raytheon got hit with an 8.4 million fine. Why? Because they had an enclave with no SSP. They failed to meet essentially DFAR 7012, which is now, uh, come in and say you need to have this in place, right, to verify that. And get this, the whistleblower who worked, right, for this corporation, that individual received $1.5 million. Okay, so I'm not saying this is like an insider threat thing, but it is an interesting take, right? This individual within the company raised a flag and was compensated for it. Morse Corp also got hit with a fine. Why? Because they reported a SPRS score that was not factual. And on top of that, they used non-FedRAMP email hosting. Again, something that we could probably identify using DNS, right? Penn State also misrepresented the implementation of the controls, used non-FedRAMP cloud providers. Okay, so now we've seen real world scenarios of breaches, red team, and also, even though there hasn't been a breach, we've seen how you can still be negatively impacted if you haven't put these controls in place the right way or have been transparent and candid about it. Now, we know what gets assessed usually in an assessment, an audit, right? You have to provide your policy, documents, your network diagrams, your access control list, so on and so forth. Great. But what Intel really comes to help with is the below the surface, right? The credentials in the dark web markets, your email security posture, which we can kind of tell if you're using a FedRAMP uh, uh, email service. Uh, and this is exactly what CISA found. Remember, they able to find this vulnerability through passive scanning, and they were able to use these weak passwords to crack using just common word lists, right? And they were able to find these trust relationships, and your security is also going to impact your partner's security. And why we bring all of this up is because the adversaries, the first thing that they do is they do this passive reconnaissance before they attack. They use open source intelligence, right, to study your organization and map out an attack. This is what they do, and it makes sense for us to also, on the defense side, use this same sort of strategy to help us prepare better and help us to prepare government contractors better, right? And a threat profile is really necessary to have in place for each and one of our government contractors who we are defending, right? And then the point is that we want to use this intel as our early warning system for them, right? And use this intel to help us to secure the CMMC readiness, but not just that, to help our government contractor clients, right? If you're an RPO or you're a consultant and you're working with them, these contractors, they're making an investment, right? $200,000 easily. Now, you don't want that investment, months of hard work, to be bypassed because somebody has your credentials already to just log right into an application who or that it stores or transmits CUI, right? So it's not just about protecting your data, it's also about protecting your revenue and your investments that you've made. So we all know how, right? You, the RPOs, the consultants, you guys know, the assessors, you guys know what the traditional approach is to prepare a government contractor for CMMC. But with an Intel enhanced approach is, first conduct a passive reconnaissance and get like a snapshot of what the actual exposure is for this domain that you're securing, right? Prioritize fixes based on real world external visibility, right? And then turn that data into intel that's actionable, that helps you to make informed CMMC scoping decisions, SSP decisions, right? Because even for things like, okay, we're going to turn on the SIM rules, right? Well, what detections are we going to put in place? Do we just put all of them in place? No, right? Because that's going to cost too much noise. So let's use our threat profile to help us to prioritize. Prioritize is a key word here. Help us to prioritize what detections we need to put in place first based on our threat profile, right? So there's many ways that Intel can help out, and from strategically, but also on a tactical and operational level. And at the end, we don't want to replace any of the compliance, right? We want to support it with this threat visibility. Now, what's the value proposition here? What do you get out of this? Well, you know what the adversaries can see and how they would exploit your government contractor client. And you're able to use that data to help you to fix the most exploitable gaps first, which hopefully gives you more confidence before that assessment day. And you can show your due diligence saying we have been proactively securing our cybersecurity posture, not just checking things off. Because we always talk about, is this CUI? It's like a whole science behind it, right? Is this CUI? It's like, is this document CUI? Who has access to it? Is it encrypted? And all those things, they're good. Those are good questions and they're necessary. However, here's an Intel driven question, right? Are the credentials for my contractor client, any of those credentials tied to an identity who accesses CUI, right? Can our domains that handle CUI be spoofed? Can we be phished easily? What would an external reconnaissance exercise reveal? Or what misconfigurations are publicly visible to the world? So, right, so hopefully you can start to see already the practicality behind all of this because that can help you to map your data flows against your external attack surface, right? You can identify these authentication weaknesses visible from the outside world. You can discover some shadow IT through domain analysis, right? Um, and just understand your exposure like an attacker would, right? So this is kind of the point here. Now, intel could be used before your engagement with your client, right? So it can help you to scope accurately with the visibility data, set realistic client expectations based on their threat profile, and you can just make yourself look different than other RPOs because all RPOs are going to be offering the same thing, right? Helping to get a contractor ready for CMMC. But you can differentiate yourself by saying we use this intel layer as well, right? Now, during the delivery of your service, you can justify recommendations because you have this external evidence to justify that. You can show your clients what adversary sees and how an adversary will go about, right? And exploiting them. You can show that attack pattern that our intel team can provide to you and prioritize that based on your exposure. Now, after your certification, you still need to maintain that cyber posture, right? Because maybe today you don't have any leak credentials on the dark web. Maybe today there's no session cookies. Maybe today there's no chatter about your company or your government contracting client if you're an RP or a consultant. Maybe there's nobody talking about you on the dark web or trying to plan something against you, right? But things change. Perhaps your client wins a big contract that has a lot of attention in 3 months from now, right? And you need to have that continuous exposure monitoring, right? You being able to provide this quarterly trend analysis showing how things have improved or gotten worse, hopefully not worse, hopefully improved, right? You should be able to maintain this ongoing value beyond just saying compliance. Here you go, your one time engagement, right? Now, this is your kind of differentiators. If you choose to go down this route, you can say things like we verify your security, not just your compliance. We do evidence-based recommendations. And the best thing here is that since this is passive intel, right? You don't have to maintain or install any tools inside of your client's network, right? I want to emphasize passive intel. Okay, we're not scanning and doing anything like that that would actually be knocking on doors, right? So just another angle on things here, the supply chain, right? You have these primes with subcontractors, or in the federal space, you have a lot of teaming opportunities. Okay, so how do you get a little bit of an idea, at least a gist of where somebody stands in terms of their cyber posture? How do you know if they have SPFD mark, a FedRAMP compliant email service, and do they have any dark web? Is anybody trying to plan an attack against them? How much liability can they bring to the table? What are their public vulnerabilities, certificate hygiene, and so much more, right? How can you tell? Well, a traditional audit would take too long to do that, especially if you're trying to, conduct it against hundreds or even less than 100. As you know, these traditional audits, they just don't scale well, right? Now, with Intel, that does passive Intel, that does scale well. We can give you an Intel report for 100 subcontractors in less than 24 hours, right? So it's uh it's something that is very scalable. So I wanted to throw that out there in case you were prime or you have any teaming opportunities coming up. That's something that also we can assist you with. So building a long-term security value in the div is really what we're trying to go after, right? We don't want to be reactive. We want to be proactive, right? We want to use this intel to help us at the end of the day secure that CUI and to support the div the best way possible. Now, here's a partnership opportunity. If this has resonated with you, well, we do have are some opportunities to collaborate. So we're your intel augmentation partner. We are passive reconnaissance experts, and we can act as your early warning system. What we're not is we're not an RPO. We are not a C3PAO or an MSP or MSSP. We enhance your services. We can help you prepare for assessments, and we can provide the intel. And you guys would benefit from adding this intel service to your portfolio. You can also, if you're a C3PO, right, you can reduce client failure rates before you commit, right? You can kind of get a snapshot of where they stand. For primes, again, you can use this intel layer to help you to scale supplier verification, right? So many use cases here. Now, if you're interested, we do have today next steps for you to take. You can get your free snapshot of your own organization, see where you stand, explore partnership models with us, custom engagement terms, and here's our contact information if you want to go or you're interested in in your own sort of custom engagement. You can go ahead and reach out to us. I will have up here now a QR code in the top right of the screen that you can scan, and you can go ahead and scan that now and schedule a call with us to talk about what would those next steps be for you, for your organization. If you're a consultant or a C3PO, you're an RPO, or you're a prime, right? There's various use cases for you, and the way that we can support you can vary. So go ahead and scan that QR code, and we would love to work together with you to help you to get that public exposure data, that threat intel, and that OSINT reporting going for you and helping you to incorporate that into your overall compliance and security strategy. Feel free to also send us questions to the email that I provided earlier. Thank you, guys. This is the end of the webinar.